Good day, everyone. I'm excited to welcome you to today's presentation. We'll be exploring a significant event in Philippine history that played a crucial role in fostering a sense of nationhood and igniting the Philippine Revolution of 1896. The focus of our discussion is the Cavite Mutiny, a pivotal moment that shaped our national identity. In this session, we'll cover the background of the mutiny, its impact on the Filipino people, and how it contributed to the larger movement for independence. So, let's dive into this important chapter of our history and understand its lasting significance. Understanding the Cavite Mutiny requires us to look at it from different perspectives, since each account offers a unique view of this significant moment in history. This event directly contributed to the Philippine Revolution of 1896, which was a pivotal struggle against Spanish colonial rule. Now, an important part of this story is the martyrdom of the Gomburza priests, 3 Filipino priests who were executed on February 17, 1872. Their death became a powerful symbol of resistance and sacrifice for Filipinos. Their martyrdom helped foster a sense of national identity and ignited a desire for justice and independence among Filipinos. This event, in many ways, laid the groundwork for our push toward nationhood. So, why does this matter? Because understanding these key moments helps us see how the fight for freedom and identity grew over time, shaping the path toward our independence. Now, let's take a closer look at the GOMBURZA, which is an acronym that stands for 3 Filipino secular priests who were executed by the Spanish colonial government. These priests are Jacinto Zamora, Jose Apolonio Burgos, and Mariano Gomez. Jacinto Zamora was the curate of the cathedral in Manila, and he was known for being a strong advocate for the rights of the Filipino secular clergy. His role was crucial because he championed the cause of Filipino priests who wanted more recognition and equality within the church hierarchy. Next, we have Jose Apolonio Burgos, who served as the curate of Bacoor in Cavite. He was often described as the soul of the movement because of his leadership and influence. Burgos was not only wealthy, but also wielded significant influence, making him a key figure in the movement for Filipino rights and reform. Finally, Mariano Gomez was also a secular priest, and together, these 3 priests became symbols of the Filipino fight for justice and independence. Their tragic execution by the Spanish authorities fueled the growing unrest and desire for reform among Filipinos. These 3 priests, GOMBURZA, are remembered for their patriotism and their contributions to the movement toward Philippine independence. They remind us of the sacrifices made by those who fought for our country's rights and freedoms. Let's talk about how each version of the event interprets its consequences. It really varies depending on who you ask, whether they focus on the impact on Filipinos or on Spanish sovereignty. The accounts differ on what the root cause was. Some say it was about lost privileges, others see it as a nationalist conspiracy, and some view it as colonial oppression. Now, when we look at the causes, there's debate too. Was it a mutiny, a revolution, or an insurrection? The words used to describe it reveal a lot about the narrator's perspective and what they want to emphasize. I also want to highlight that Filipino students are encouraged to research these different accounts of the Cavite Mutiny. Comparing them helps develop critical thinking and a deeper understanding of history. It's a great way to sharpen your analytical skills. Remember, we're talking about one event, but it can be seen through many different lenses. That's why multiple accounts exist, each offering a unique interpretation. This diversity of perspectives enriches our understanding and reminds us that history is often complex and multifaceted. Ahora vamos a explorar la versión en español de la comunidad de Cavite. Es importante entender cómo esta comunidad se presenta en su idioma, y que refleja su identidad cultural y su historia. Al hablar de la comunidad, no solo nos referimos a los aspectos geográficos, sino también a las tradiciones, costumbres y valores que la definen. La lengua, en este caso, el español, tiene un papel fundamental en la narrativa local, ayudandonos a entender mejor sus races y su manera de conectarse con el pasado. Además, ver cómo se adapta y mansión, viva esta versión en español nos permite apreciar la riqueza cultural y la diversidad que caracteriza a Cavite. En definitiva, este aspecto nos ayuda a tener una visión más completa de la comunidad y su importancia en el contexto más amplio de nuestra presentación. In this slide, we're looking at José Montero y Vidal's account, which was published in the Historia General de Filipinas. Now, this account has sparked quite a bit of controversy, mainly because Dr. Th. Pardo de Tavera criticized it heavily. He described it as the work of a Spaniard bent on perverting the facts at his pleasure, which is quite a strong statement. Essentially, Pardo de Tavera believed that Montero y Vidal's version was biased and not a faithful representation of the events. Montero y Vidal framed the mutiny as part of a larger conspiracy against Spanish rule in the Philippines. He suggested that it wasn't just a spontaneous uprising, but part of a coordinated effort, implicating prominent nationalist figures, including the Gomburza priests. This framing is significant because it reflects a particular perspective, one that perhaps aims to justify Spanish authority by depicting the mutiny as a threat orchestrated by Filipino nationalists. Understanding this account is crucial because it shows us how historical narratives can be shaped by the author's perspective, especially in colonial contexts. It also ties into the overall theme of how history is written and reinterpreted, often influenced by political motives or personal biases. So, with the establishment of a new government in Spain that was less radical than the one that had appointed La Torre, he was eventually relieved from his post. As Montero y Vidal notes, this shift was significant because it reflected a change in the colonial administration's approach. When a more moderate government took control, they decided that La Torre's policies, which had been quite firm, no longer aligned with their vision. This change in leadership had real implications. It marked a turning point in how the colony was governed, especially since La Torre's approach had been quite strict and confrontational. His departure signaled a move away from previous reforms that he might have supported or implemented. It's important to understand the context here. La Torre assumed control on April 4, 1871, and his conservative, hardline approach actually reversed some of the earlier reforms aimed at easing tensions or promoting reform. This reversal only heightened tensions across the colony, because many Filipinos had begun to hope for more progressive changes. So, in essence, the arrival of a new, less radical government signaled a shift in policies, which ultimately affected the governance and the hopes of the Filipino people during this period. Let's take a closer look at some of the complex factors that contributed to the revolt. One interesting point is that a section of the native clergy, perhaps out of spite towards the friars, allegedly aligned themselves with enemies of Spain. This shows how internal conflicts and resentments could be exploited, fueling discontent. Moving on, we see that democratic publications and speeches played a significant role in inspiring independence-minded Filipinos. These ideas of liberty and self-governance spread through the press and speeches, helping to build a sense of national identity and resistance. Additionally, the revolutionary wave wasn't just local. It was influenced by broader international events. The overthrow of the Spanish throne, for example, helped spread republican and democratic ideas to the Philippines, further encouraging revolutionary sentiments. Finally, according to historian Montero y Vidal, the causes of the revolt were more than just specific grievances like the abolition of privileges for Cavite arsenal workers. He pointed out that there were broader destabilizing forces at play, including political upheaval and revolutionary ideas circulating from Spain and abroad. Understanding these interconnected causes helps us see the revolt not as a single event, but as a culmination of many social, political, and ideological factors. The uprising was originally planned for the evening of January 20, 1872, but unfortunately, things didn't go as expected. The conspirators had coordinated a series of signals and actions, starting with rockets fired from the walls of Manila, which were meant to serve as the prearranged signal between those in Cavite and Manila. Once the signal was given, native soldiers were supposed to assassinate their officers, and servants would kill their masters. Additionally, the plan included eliminating the Captain General's escort at Malacañang to ensure the success of the uprising. The Spanish account describes this conspiracy as quite extensive, with roots tracing back to the era of Governor La Torre. It involved secret meetings held at the homes of notable figures like D. Joaquin Pardo de Tavera and Father Jacinto Zamora. According to Montero y Vidal, this was a broad and deeply rooted conspiracy, showing that the movement wasn't just a spontaneous act, but part of a longer history of resistance. Understanding these details gives us a clearer picture of how organized and serious the plans were, even if ultimately they didn't succeed. At 9:30 p.m., around 200 native soldiers, led by Sergeant La Madrid, rose up in revolt. They managed to assassinate the fort commander and wounded his wife in the process. This was a significant act of rebellion, showing the unrest brewing among the native troops. Now, on the same night, in the district of Sampaloc, there was a celebration happening, the Feast of the Virgin of Loreto. Fireworks and rockets were being fired into the sky, creating a festive atmosphere. However, what's interesting here is that those in Cavite, seeing the fireworks, mistook them for signals to start a revolt. This misunderstanding, known as the Fiesta misunderstanding, shows how miscommunication can escalate tensions. Overall, this event highlights how complex and fragile the situation was, how a local religious celebration inadvertently contributed to the perception of an uprising, tying into the larger theme of misunderstandings fueling conflict during this period. After the uprising on January 20, General Ginovs took a strategic approach. He waited a full day, giving the rebels a chance to surrender peacefully. On January 21, an ultimatum was issued, offering the rebels one last opportunity to lay down their arms. When they refused, the assault was launched on January 22. The result was devastating. Most of the rebels were killed, and those who survived were taken prisoner. That same day, an official proclamation declared the revolt suppressed. This sequence highlights how the authorities responded decisively, showing their determination to restore order. It also underscores the brutal reality of suppressing uprisings. Sometimes, the conflict ends with significant loss of life. Overall, this episode reflects the intense efforts to maintain control and stability during that turbulent period. On February 5, 1872, the Council of War sentenced Gomburza and Saldua to death by strangulation. However, just a day later, the Governor-General commuted Gomburza's and Saldua's sentences to life imprisonment, showing how the authorities responded differently to these figures. Moving on to the broader context, there were 11 more individuals who faced death sentences, again, by the Council of War, though their sentences were later confirmed by the Captain General on January 27. This pattern highlights how the Spanish authorities used military tribunals to quickly sentence those they saw as threats, often without thorough evidence. And it wasn't just priests or known revolutionaries. Based on prisoner declarations, Spanish authorities arrested a wide range of people, including priests, lawyers, and prominent Filipinos. This broad crackdown aimed to suppress any potential support for reform or rebellion, and it underscores how the repression affected many layers of Filipino society during this tumultuous period. All of this ties back to the overall theme of how oppressive measures were used to maintain control, often at the expense of justice and fairness. On the morning of February 17th, a significant event unfolded that would echo through history. Filipino troops were the main force present during this moment, demonstrating the serious and controlled environment of the execution. The fort batteries were carefully aimed at the execution site, always on alert, ready to fire if there was any sign of uprising or disturbance. This shows how tense and volatile the situation was. The order of execution was precise. Gomez would be first, followed by Zamora, then Burgos, and finally Saldua. This sequence was carefully planned and reflects the importance and gravity of the event. It's a stark reminder of the sacrifices made by these individuals in their fight for justice and independence. As Montero y Vidal described, early that morning, a large crowd gathered at Bagumbayan to witness what was about to happen. The scene was historic. An immense multitude came to witness the execution of these brave men, knowing that what they saw was more than just a passing event. It was a symbol of the struggle for freedom and the cost of that fight. This moment is a pivotal point in our history, illustrating both the brutality of colonial repression and the resilience of Filipino patriotism. It connects deeply to our overall theme of sacrifice and the enduring spirit of those who fought for our country's independence. En julio de 1872, los soldados peninsulars españoles llegaron a Manila, marcando un momento importante en la historia colonial. Para celebrar su llegada, se llevó a cabo una misa especial en la iglesia de Santo Domingo, a la que asistieron altas autoridades del gobierno, mostrando la importancia de esta presencia militar en la región. Este evento fue parte de una serie de medidas que reflejaban la intención de reforzar el control español en Filipinas. Un ejemplo de esto fue la disolución del Regimiento de Artillería Nativa en abril de ese mismo año, ordenada por el gobernador Izquierdo. En su lugar, se creó una nueva fuerza compuesta exclusivamente por peninsulars, lo que evidenció la preferencia por oficiales españoles en las fuerzas militares. Además, en esa época, la audiencia tomó medidas contra figuras prominentes del movimiento filipino, suspendiendo a varios abogados destacados como Basa, Pardo de Tavera y Regidor. Esto fue una muestra clara de cómo las autoridades españolas buscaban limitar la influencia de los líderes locales y mantener su control. En conjunto, estas acciones, la llegada de los españoles, la reorganización militar y las suspensions legales, reflejaban una serie de medidas españolas que buscaban consolidar su dominio en Filipinas tras los sucesos del 1872. Todo esto forma parte del contexto más amplio de cómo España intentaba mantener su autoridad frente a las crecientes demandas de autonomía y cambio en la colonia. Ngayon, tatalakan natin ang Filipino version ng Cavite Mutiny. Sa bahagi na ito, makikita natin kung paano nadapt ang konsepto ng Mutiny sa kulturang Pilipino. Mahalagang manawan na ang pagkakaroon ng isang komunidad na nakabate sa Filipino values ay nagsusulong ng mas malalim na koneksyon at pagtutulungan. Dito, makikita natin ang mga parang kung paano napapasa ang mga tradisyon, paniniwala, at mga gawain na nagpapalakas sa samahan. Ang panganang layunin ay mapanatili ang pagkakaisa at pagtutulungan sa kabila ng pagbabago at modernisasyon. Sa kabuuan, ang Filipino version ng Cavite Mutiny ay nagsisilbing inspirasyon, upang mas mapalalim pa ang ating pagmamalasakit sa isa't isa at sa ating kultura. Ito ay isang palala na ang tunay na lakas ay nagmumula sa pagkakaisa at pagtutulungan ng buong komunidad. Let's take a closer look at Dr. Trinidad H. Pardo de Tavera's perspective. He was a Filipino scientist, academic, and historian who offered a very different interpretation of the Cavite Mutiny. Unlike others who saw it as part of a larger nationalist movement, Tavera believed it was simply a revolt by soldiers and workers. His key point was that their anger stemmed from the removal of their privileges, not from any grand conspiracy aiming for independence. This view helps us understand that not everyone saw the event as a deliberate push for freedom, but rather as a reaction to specific grievances. It reminds us to consider multiple perspectives when analyzing historical events, especially those as complex as this one. So, Tavera's account challenges us to think about the motivations behind the mutiny and how it fits into the larger narrative of Filipino history. Izquierdo's first act was to prohibit a school of arts and trades being organized by prominent Filipinos, accusing its founders of political motives. Supporters of ex-Governor La Torre were labeled personas sospechosas, suspects, a term that would come to define colonial repression going forward. The new governor soon made it clear that his views were different from those of La Torre. He immediately announced that he intended to govern the people, with a crucifix in one hand and a sword in the other. This quote from Dr. Pardo de Tavera really highlights how Izquierdo's approach marked a shift in tone. It shows that his methods would be both religiously and militarily assertive, signaling a more repressive stance compared to his predecessor. Overall, this change in tone reflects the increasing control and tightening of authority during this period. According to Tavera, it's important to understand that this single policy decision, rather than some sort of vast nationalist conspiracy, was actually the true origin of the unrest that erupted on January 20, 1872. What happened was that the governor decided to abolish certain privileges that had long been in place. He ordered all workers who had previously enjoyed these exemptions to start paying tribute and performing labor. Naturally, many workers initially went on strike to protest these changes. However, under pressure and threats from the authorities, they eventually returned to work. Now, it's also crucial to note the context here, Izquierdo's order. Historically, arsenal workers and those in the artillery and engineering corps had been exempt from tribute taxes and forced labor on public works. These exemptions had been in place for a very long time, almost from time immemorial. So the core issue wasn't just the policy itself, but what was taken away, these long-standing privileges. When those were revoked, it ignited the unrest. This highlights how deeply rooted these exemptions were in the social fabric and how their removal directly triggered the crisis. It all ties back to the overall theme, how a single policy shift can reveal underlying tensions and spark significant upheaval. On the night of January 20, 1872, the uprising in Cavite began, marking a significant moment in our history. Izquierdo, recognizing the threat, sent the commanding general to Cavite to handle the situation. The rebels, however, faced swift and decisive action. They were put to the sword with little mercy shown. During the chaos, Sergeant La Madrid was caught in a powder explosion that blinded him, and unfortunately he was also cut down in the fighting. What's important to understand here is that the rebels expected broader support from the larger army, perhaps to make their movement more effective. But that support never arrived. The uprising remained isolated in Cavite, which meant it lacked the reinforcement and resources it might have needed to grow into a larger rebellion. This was not a widespread rebellion, but rather a localized one, involving around 40 Marines and 22 artillerymen under Sergeant La Madrid. The entire Cavite garrison was believed to be disaffected, meaning many soldiers were unhappy and possibly sympathetic to the rebels' cause. The uprising itself started suddenly, with soldiers at Fort San Felipe in Cavite revolting and quickly turning against Spanish authority. The commanding officer and some nearby Spanish officials were assassinated in the chaos, signaling how serious and immediate this threat was. In summary, this event was a pivotal moment that revealed underlying discontent within the military and set the stage for future struggles against Spanish rule. It underscores how even a seemingly small uprising could ignite larger calls for change across the nation. They blamed the Madrid government's liberal reforms and ex-governor La Torre's policies for encouraging Filipino disloyalty. And they used the mutiny as an opportunity to reverse all those reforms and to strengthen the power of the friars. According to Tavera, the Cavite mutiny gave the conservative, pro-friar forces a very powerful opportunity. They argued to Madrid that there was a vast conspiracy threatening Spanish sovereignty across the entire archipelago. This was a crucial moment because it allowed the friars and conservative elements to push back against any progressive changes and to solidify their influence, which ties into the broader theme of how reform efforts were thwarted and control was maintained through these events. So in this slide, we see that the Madrid government, faced with a difficult situation, was unable to effectively counter conservative opinions or take the time needed for a proper investigation. Instead, they resorted to sudden repressive measures, which were quite harsh and indiscriminate. What's particularly notable here is that prominent Filipinos, whether priests, lawyers, mestizos, or even pure-blood Tagalogs, were persecuted without any distinction or fair process. It didn't matter who they were targeted simply because of their prominence or influence. A quote from Dr. Pardo de Tavera really highlights the gravity of this approach. He points out that there seemed to be no real effort to distinguish innocent people from the guilty. Instead, the main goal appeared to be to create fear, by making examples out of certain individuals, an approach that prioritized terror over justice. This slide underscores how Madrid's response was more about instilling fear than seeking truth or fairness, which ties into the larger theme of colonial repression and the struggle for justice during this period. Let's take a closer look at this slide. The key point here is that the punishments handed down were not only unjust, but also unnecessary from every perspective. There was no real intention on anyone's part to overthrow Spanish sovereignty, which makes these harsh punishments even more troubling. Tavera's verdict condemned all three main accused, Burgos, Zamora, and Gomez, to death by military court-martial. But it wasn't just them. Many others, including lawyers, curates, and ilustrados, those enlightened Filipinos, were sentenced to life imprisonment in the Marianas Islands. Now, why were Burgos, Zamora, and Gomez specifically targeted? These men had been strong opponents of the friars, especially in disputes over church curacies across various provinces. Their opposition made them stand out as threats to the friars' influence, which likely contributed to their harsh treatment. This slide highlights a crucial point. Gomburza became victims of friar politics, used as scapegoats to suppress dissent and maintain the status quo. Their case reflects larger issues of injustice and the oppressive control exercised by the friars during that period. Understanding this helps us see how their trial was less about justice and more about silencing those who dared to challenge the existing power structures. The persecutions that the Filipino people faced served as a surprising catalyst, really acting as both a stimulus and an educational force. According to Dr. Pardo de Tavera, these hardships actually helped nurture the rebellion in secret. It's interesting to note that before Izquierdo's persecutions, most Filipinos didn't even aspire for independence. Their goals were more about improving their material conditions and education. What's really key here is that these persecutions, which were based on a false assumption that Filipinos were seeking separation, ended up having the opposite effect. Instead of preventing rebellion, they actually fueled it, making the desire for independence grow stronger. This is a perfect example of how unintended consequences can shape history in unexpected ways. The very actions meant to suppress and control ended up planting the seeds for a much larger movement, connecting to our broader theme of how oppression can sometimes backfire and inspire resistance. Not a few hecho, para sanar las heridas abiertas. La política del gobierno de recordar a los Filipinos los castigos del pasado solo aumentaba su descontento. Día tras día, la gente se sentía más frustrada y molesta. En lugar de reducir el poder de los frailes, Madrid tuvo que fortalecerlo, porque la influencia de los frailes creció y se consolidó. Ahora, ellos eran vistos como los verdaderos dueños del pueblo filipino. Desde ese momento, cualquier desacuerdo, por trivial que fuera, entre españoles y filipinos se interpretaba siempre en términos raciales o políticos. La tensión racial y política se volvió cada vez más evidente y profunda. Esto se convirtió en una herida que, en realidad, nunca sanó, y que seguiría afectando la relación entre los dos grupos por mucho tiempo. On January 23, 1872, just 3 days after the uprising, Governor General Rafael de Izquierdo submitted an official report to the Spanish Ministry of War. In this report, he described the events using strong words like insurrection, uprising, and even revolution, which shows how serious and threatening he saw the situation. He also pointed fingers at specific groups within the local community, blaming the native clergy, scholars, mestizo lawyers, and abogadillos as the main instigators of the unrest. This report is significant because it reflects the official Spanish perspective at the time, framing the rebellion as a deliberate and organized challenge to Spanish authority. It helps us understand how the colonial administration perceived and responded to these events, which ties into the larger theme of colonial resistance and the struggle for autonomy. In this slide, we see that Izquierdo argued that the accusations of tribute and labor complaints were actually just pretexts. He believed they were used to incite rebellion, rather than being the true causes of the unrest. Essentially, he saw these grievances as convenient excuses rather than legitimate issues. Moving on, we notice that educated Filipinos and abogadillos from Manila, Cavite, and nearby provinces were accused of leading the conspiracy. These individuals were often lawyers or legal advocates, which is why they're referred to as mestizo lawyers, people of mixed heritage with a legal background who played a significant role in the rebellion's planning. Additionally, priests were also accused of organizing and spiritually motivating the rebellion among soldiers. This highlights how influential religious figures could be in shaping the sentiments of the insurgents. The most telling part of this slide is Gen Izquierdo's summary, where he states that it appears the insurrection was motivated and organized by native clergy, mestizo and native lawyers, and what he calls abogadillos, small-time lawyers or advocates. All these groups are seen as the instigators behind the rebellion, according to Izquierdo. It's important because it underscores how various segments of Filipino society, especially those with legal or religious influence, were perceived as playing key roles in inciting the uprising. This ties into our overall theme of understanding the different factors and actors involved in the rebellion, and how colonial authorities viewed these figures as central to the unrest. Let's take a closer look at some of the promises made during this period. Lawyers and abogadillos, or young lawyers, were actually promised control over government, administration, and justice in the new order. This was a way to secure their support and legitimize the movement. When it comes to political power, the rebels offered the wealth of the Spaniards and the regular clergy, along with military ranks. They even promised to create 15 new native battalions, with rebel soldiers serving as officers. This was a strategic move to appeal to local elites and troops alike, showing that power and rewards could be within their reach. As for promises of wealth, they persuaded soldiers that divine support was on their side. They told them that a priest could become the new hari, or king, of the movement, and that daily masses would be held in celebration of their success. This blending of spiritual motivation with political aims was key to rallying support. Superstition played a significant role as well. According to Izquierdo's report, the instigators used various methods to recruit soldiers into the conspiracy. They tapped into religious beliefs and superstitions to seduce native troops, making the movement not just a political rebellion, but also a spiritual cause. All these tactics, power, wealth, divine favor, and superstition, were carefully orchestrated to build support and motivate people to join the rebellion. It shows how complex and multi-layered these efforts were, connecting deeply with the hopes, fears, and beliefs of those involved. On this slide, we see that Izquierdo was almost certain that the designated leader of the rebellion would be either Fr. José Burgos or Fr. Jacinto Zamora, both of whom were parish priests in San Pedro, Manila. This indicates how central these figures were perceived to be in the movement. He also noted that all Spaniards and friars involved would face execution, while foreigners would be spared. This reflects the intense nationalist and anti-colonial sentiment driving the uprising. Moving on, Izquierdo pointed out that it was still unclear whether the rebels intended to establish a monarchy or a republic. Interestingly, he mentioned that the Tagalog language didn't even have a word for these political forms, which highlights the cultural and linguistic differences influencing political concepts at the time. The rebels planned to call their head of government Hari, which is the Tagalog word for king, suggesting a possible inclination toward monarchy, but it's not entirely certain. Overall, this slide gives us a glimpse into the uncertainties and plans of the revolutionaries, as well as the strong feelings against colonial authorities. It also underscores how language and culture shape political identity and aspirations during this turbulent period. In this slide, we're looking at how the plan required close coordination between Manila and Cavite. The idea was for these locations to work together seamlessly to carry out the operation. However, things didn't go exactly as planned. The Cavite rebels actually moved ahead of schedule, which created a significant problem. Meanwhile, the Spanish naval forces were on high alert, actively preventing Camarino's forces from crossing over to the fort. This combination of unexpected rebel timing and vigilant Spanish patrols caused the entire plan to collapse before it could be executed effectively. Now, the rebels in Cavite attempted to seize the fort, specifically aiming to take Fort San Felipe. Their strategy involved firing cannons to alert other rebel forces and signal Cavite that an attack was underway. The goal was to create chaos and seize the fort while the city was distracted and in disarray. Additionally, there was an attempt to seize Fort Santiago by starting a large fire to distract the authorities. The rebels also planned to ignite Tondo, which was part of their broader operational plan to cause confusion and weaken the Spanish defenses. Overall, this plan highlights both the daring nature of the rebels' tactics and the challenges they faced with coordination and timing, especially against a vigilant colonial power. It's a vivid example of how the rebellion was a complex mix of bold actions and unpredictable obstacles. Izquierdo había recibido advertencias anónimas de manera continua, pero optó por no actuar sobre ellas para evitar causar alarma. Sin embargo, mantenía una vigilancia constante, aunque con fuerzas peninsulares limitadas. Las cartas anónimas sugieren que la junta probablemente recibió inspiración desde Madrid. Donde periódicos liberales como El Eco Filipino eran enviados y distribuidos en las Filipinas por personas que luego fueron encarceladas. Además, Izquierdo reportó que había información confidencial indicando que una junta en Manila había estado organizándose desde 1869, usando una sociedad de artes y oficios como pretexto. Es importante destacar que esta sociedad ya había sido suspendida, pero la existencia de estos contactos y advertencias anteriores resulta como la información y la vigilancia siempre estuvieron en el centro de la situación. Esto conecta con la idea de que, a pesar de las limitaciones, la inteligencia y las advertencias previas jugaban un papel crucial en la dinámica del movimiento. Let's take a moment to compare the three accounts we've discussed. As you can see, each account offers a unique perspective on the events, highlighting different details and emphasizing various aspects. The first account provides a detailed, almost personal view, giving us insight into the emotions and thoughts of the individual involved. The second account tends to focus more on the factual sequence of events, offering clarity and structure. Meanwhile, the third account brings in contextual information that helps us understand the broader implications. By examining these differences, we can see how multiple perspectives contribute to a fuller understanding of the situation. This comparison underscores the importance of multiple sources in building a comprehensive picture, which ties back to our overall theme of critical analysis and understanding. The words we choose to describe historical events can really shape how we remember them, and more importantly, they reveal underlying political agendas. On this slide, we see how framing the event as part of the Spanish colonial narrative casts it as a full-scale attempt to overthrow Spanish sovereignty. This term, revolution, carries a strong connotation of a major upheaval aiming to challenge legitimate authority, which in turn justifies harsh responses from the colonizers. Now, Izquierdo's preferred term was insurrection. This word suggests a more limited, perhaps less organized form of resistance, more like a military rebellion than a true political upheaval. It aligns with the Filipino framing that downplays the event's political significance and minimizes its scope. And then there's mutiny, which is even more restrained, implying a straightforward military disobedience without broader political motives. All of this highlights the power of language. The words we use don't just describe reality, they shape it. They influence how history perceives the event, what it signifies, and how we interpret the motivations behind it. So, understanding these different terms helps us see the underlying political agendas at play and reminds us to be critical of the language used in historical narratives. Now, let's take a closer look at some of the key figures involved in the Cavite Mutiny. In 1871, the mutiny happened under circumstances that deeply angered the Filipino population, especially because of the revocation of worker privileges and the harsh reprisals that followed. These actions are central to understanding the causes of the uprising. One significant figure was Governor General Izquierdo. He was also the curate of Manila Cathedral and a half-blood Chinese. His home actually served as a meeting place for nationalist leaders, which highlights his importance in the movement. Sadly, he was executed second among those involved. Then we have Fr. Jacinto Zamora, also a curate of Manila Cathedral. He was a half-blood Spaniard and a fierce opponent of friar control over curacies. His opposition made him a target, and he was executed third. Next is Fr. José Burgos, the curate of Bacoor, Cavite. He's often described as the movement's soul because of his influence and wealth. He was the first to be executed at Bagumbayan, making him a martyr in the eyes of many Filipinos. Finally, there's Fr. Mariano Gomez, another key figure. These individuals played crucial roles in the events leading up to the mutiny and are remembered for their leadership and sacrifice. Together, these figures embody the growing Filipino resistance against oppressive colonial rule, and their stories are vital to understanding the broader context of the uprising. The deaths of Gomburza became a crucial turning point in Filipino history. They planted the seeds of the propaganda movement, which sought reforms and greater rights for Filipinos under Spanish rule. This movement eventually grew into the Philippine Revolution of 1896, sparking a fight for independence. Gomburza also proved that Filipinos could be persecuted just for advocating their rights. Their execution was a stark reminder of the injustices they faced, but it also turned them into symbols of resistance. Their martyrdom inspired many Filipinos to stand up and fight for freedom. In fact, their sacrifice amplified Filipino resistance rather than silencing it. One of the most notable figures inspired by Gomburza was José Rizal. He dedicated his famous novel, El Filibusterismo, to their memory, using literature as a powerful tool to ignite the revolutionary spirit. So, the legacy of Gomburza is profound. Their sacrifice not only challenged the injustices of their time, but also inspired future generations to pursue independence and justice. Their story reminds us how the sacrifices of a few can plant the seeds for a nation's future. Tavera's account really makes this clear. The persecutions of 1872 shifted people's loyalty from being passive to actively resisting. What was once a quiet, secret defiance started to grow openly. The rebellion, which had been kept hidden for a long time, actually took over 2 decades to develop fully. It didn't happen overnight. Instead, it was a slow, persistent process that eventually burst into a full-scale revolution by 1896. So this slide shows us how a small act of resistance can evolve into a major uprising over time. It's a powerful reminder of how perseverance and long-term efforts can lead to significant change, connecting to our overall theme of resistance and revolutionary growth. When analyzing the Cavite Mutiny, students should ask themselves some critical questions. First, what does each account leave out? Whose voices are missing from these narratives? And what would a more complete picture require? It's important to recognize the gaps in the sources we're examining. For example, Izquierdo cites prisoner declarations, giving us insight into the perspectives of those who were imprisoned. Tavera, on the other hand, references policy records and outcomes, offering an official view of the events. Montero y Vidal draws on official Spanish sources, which can reflect the colonial perspective. Next, we should consider the purpose behind each account. Are they trying to justify colonial policy, defend Filipino dignity, or simply report official findings? Each intent influences what details are included or omitted. Additionally, understanding who authored these accounts helps us interpret their reliability and bias. Montero y Vidal was Spanish, likely representing the colonial government's viewpoint. Tavera was Filipino, potentially providing a local perspective. Izquierdo was the colonial governor himself, which might mean a more official or authoritative stance. So, when we approach the Cavite Mutiny, asking these questions about what's missing, the evidence used, the purpose, and the author's backgrounds allows us to critically evaluate the different narratives and strive for a fuller understanding of the historical event. When we analyze multiple accounts, we develop the critical skills necessary to uncover the true historical narrative and build well-supported arguments. It's important to remember that different perspectives, like those from Spanish, Filipino, and official sources, each tell a unique story. These stories are influenced by the narrator's position, their agenda, and what access they had to information. Understanding that perspective matters helps us see the bigger picture and recognize biases. The Cavite Mutiny of 1872, along with the execution of Gomburza, marked significant turning points in the Filipino struggle for identity and independence. These events galvanized many Filipinos and fueled the movement toward freedom. So, the key takeaway here is that analyzing diverse accounts and understanding different perspectives are essential skills. They help us grasp history more fully and appreciate the complex factors that shaped the Filipino fight for independence. This approach ties back to our overall goal of developing a well-rounded, critical understanding of history.